Hello class and welcome to your chapter 10 lecture where we're going to be discussing short and long-term confinements. Learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end you should be able to describe the purpose and operation of short-term confinement facilities including jails, detention centers, and shelter care facilities. Describe the purpose and operation of long-term juvenile correctional facilities, including boot camps, reception and diagnostic centers, and ranches or forestry camps, as well as describe the goals, programs, and operation of training schools, and summarize the rights of juveniles who are institutionalized. So we're going to start off with short-term confinements. So short-term confinement, we're going to talk about jail first. So when we consider jail, some of the issues that we have within those facilities is overcrowding, sexual victimization, and suicide of youthful offenders. So the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act actually required states to remove juveniles from adult jails and lockups by 1989. And the number of youth in adult facilities reduced, but then increased the number of youth that we saw being transferred to the adult court. So in 2010, there were over 7,500 youth under the age of 18 being held in adult jails. And years before that, in 2004, 74% of jail inmates who were younger than 18 were actually being held as adults. And there was this belief that separating juveniles and adults in jails was sufficient to protect them from the effects of jail confinement, but we know that that's not the case. The environment of a jail is just not appropriate for youthful offenders. So now the only time a juvenile can be placed in a jail is if they're being charged as an adult, they still have to be kept separate from the adults in that facility. Other short-term confinement, we have detention centers, and this is really just an alternative to putting juveniles in jail then, so it's sort of the juvenile version. It's really only a temporary holding, and 50% of them offer no treatment programs. Again, because they are really supposed to be very short-term, and when I say short-term, I mean short-term. A juvenile really should not be in detention for more than 30 or 60 days. It's really just to determine what is the best disposition for this juvenile. A detention center is never typically, a juvenile's not ordered to be confined at a detention center. In Boulder, Colorado, they actually initiated what they considered attention homes instead of detention centers. Their philosophy was that youth needed attention rather than detention. So they had programming and encouraged interactions between the staff and the residents to really help address the juveniles' concerns and issues. Another type of short-term confinement that we have are shelter care facilities. And again, these are more for dependent and neglected youth, though once in a great while you'll see a juvenile who has a delinquent charge placed in a shelter care. So home visits are permitted, so the youth can leave and go home to visit their family typically. They'll be given community trips even. They'll take trips to almost like field trips with the youth to give them those experiences. But unfortunately, we have the issue of juveniles being able to run away from shelter care facilities because they are non-secure, so the juvenile could leave. And the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act actually mandated that non-criminal youth be placed in these facilities. Again, part of that sort of deinstitutionalization of status offenders and trying to separate delinquent from dependent and neglected youth. Some of the long-term confinement options that we have are things like boot camps. So this is where really shock treatment is emphasized with a military discipline. We have reception and diagnostic centers where a juvenile would go to be evaluated and determine what the appropriate placement facility is for them. Ranches and forestry camps are more minimum security, and they have really this survival or outdoor component to them. There's not as many of these as we used to have back in the day, but there still are a few out there. I would say it's more or less that these forestry camps incorporate aspects of outdoor and survival, but they're more of like almost staying at like a cabin in the woods, and they're going to get treatment and they're going to get education, maybe some job abilities, and they're just going to incorporate some of those outdoor components. And then you have training centers or schools, which are really what we typically see and what we would typically place juveniles in, which are more longer and more secure institutional stays or facilities. So going into a little bit more detail here, the boot camps can be described as really giving this physical and regimented training. Typically, it's a 30 to 100-day stay for more moderate risk offenders. And good programs are going to be individualized and tailored to the youth. But we see the recidivism rates are actually higher than or similar to other types of confinement. So they're not really very effective. You'll have, say, drill instructors and things like group punishment being employed. So again, good programs will also add in those rehabilitative measures, treatment, counseling. And unfortunately, a number of youth have actually died at boot camps because of ineffective management and either reckless or negligent behaviors on part of the staff. So the Dozer School for Boys was actually one famous one. So it operated from January of 1900 through June of 2011. And it was a reform school operated by the state of Florida down in the panhandle town of Mariana. And what happened was they had, which is the picture you see here, juveniles were actually being physically and sexually assaulted by staff. And these boys a lot of them didn't have family or immediate family, or the families really didn't have the means to understand what was happening or to get to the facility and see what was going on with the boys. And a number of boys actually lost their lives to this brutal environment and treatment by staff. It was actually very sad. And this is just one of the boys who was placed in this school who came back and was looking at all these different grave sites now, because that was the other thing. They would bury the boys on site and just never report things to the state. And so, unfortunately, that was allowed to go on for as long as it was. If you're ever interested, there's some podcasts and some documentaries out there on the school that you could look into. Then we have some reception and diagnostic centers. Again, the juvenile is just going to be here for a very short-term stay, 4 to 6 weeks, where they're really just assessing the youth and coming up with an appropriate treatment plan, identifying where the best place would be for the juvenile and what are some maybe academic needs that they have, mental health, psychological needs. What is the best place for this juvenile? So they're not going to be here very long. And not every youth is going to go through a reception or diagnostic center. It's not always the case. Then we have ranches and forestry camps for more minor offenses or those who are committed to the State Department of Youth Services. They'll do things like landscaping and conservation work. This is just a picture of an example of what one of maybe the forestry camps would look like. They'll typically have individual meetings with social workers and group therapy. They'll attend community events, and sometimes they're even given home passes on the weekends. And it's really important that staff have a relationship with the youth within these facilities. Though, just like anything else, you can also look up, there's some pretty awful stories, and there's a good documentary out there. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it talks about this sort of one forestry camp type of program where it was a female program, and they really were just being severely mistreated. It was so strict, and the girls had a really tough time at this program. So with anything else, all of these programs, they do have the potential to be great and to have a great impact on the juveniles, but a lot of it is going to depend on the staff and the human beings that are running the program. So we also have some training schools, where the goal of training schools, and we're going to talk about these for the next couple slides here, the goal of training schools are really for obedience and conformity. So it's emphasizing surveillance and rules, and either re-education or developing their educational skills. So teaching things like hard work, intellectual growth, and rewarding the juvenile for conforming. And then treatment. So staff are going to work with and help and permit residents to really be more emotionally connected through those treatment options. When we talk about the security of these training schools, you have either minimum, medium, or maximum. Again, medium, maybe youth are locked in their rooms to sleep at night, but otherwise it's more of a cottage-like or home feel. Or maybe they're only locked in their rooms when they're completely out of control. Medium risk are going to be more of a sort of dormitory or cottage look to the facility, though they may have some perimeter fencing around just to ensure that the juvenile doesn't escape. And then maximum security is going to be more typical of what you see here, where you're going to have sort of that barbed wire. You're going to have all of completely locked doors. You're going to have fencing. You're going to have security, lots of cameras to ensure that juveniles don't get out. And there's one program in Pennsylvania where it's a medium training school, but then actually within the confines, so there's one fence around the big medium school, and then within the confines, there is a maximum security training school. So there's another fence around that specific area within that school. So it's sort of a double layer. What types of programs do they offer in training schools? Everything. You have everything from their education to basic skills like reading and writing. A lot of them will offer different vocations for juveniles to get certified in. Some of them even have competitive sports and then recreational activities. Really, whatever a juvenile would be offered in the community is pretty much offered in these training schools. So religious services, and then of course your treatment. And juveniles can earn day and weekend passes because again, the juvenile is ultimately going to come home with their family. So it is really important that we consistently reinforce those relationships and work on that while a juvenile is in placement. How do they operate? Well, a lot of them will have cottage parents, or they're considered youth supervisors, cottage supervisors. They go by different names. But what they're responsible for is getting the residents up, making sure that they go to meal times and have hygiene. They'll take them to their classes or different jobs in the community. They intervene when there's conflicts among staff, and they may be responsible even for searching the living areas and bedrooms of these juveniles if someone suspects there's contraband. And then even personal and institutional advisement. Typically, there's structured after school time, so the juveniles are not just left to do whatever they want. They may have a little bit of free time that's like an hour that's offered where they can sort of sit in their rooms quietly and work on whatever it is they want to work on. But these programs are very regimented. So there's a lot of recreational time that's organized and organized activities for the juveniles to engage in to keep them busy. And to be honest, because most of the time when youth are in the community, they have way too much free time on their hands. And that's sometimes what contributes to them getting into trouble. So we're trying to keep their time filled and busy here. We do have 3 issues though with institutionalization. So the first one is victimization, where you can really have these predatory practices where juveniles who are stronger, they can tend to prey on those who are a little bit weaker. So you might see some physical or sexual victimization, even emotional or psychological. So it's really up to those staff, the cottage parents, the supervisors, to jump in and not allow that to happen and address it when it does. Also, the social roles of female in training schools. So strong females will tend to take advantage of those, again, who are weaker. And aggression is really a dominant force in their living environment. So those females who are more aggressive in the female training schools will really take advantage of those who are weaker and try to pretty much run them. And then you also have the issue of disproportionate minority confinement, where we know that individuals who belong to minority groups are involved with the justice system at higher rates than whites. And when we talk about minority confinement, they also tend to be confined at higher rates than their white counterparts. So again, the JJDPA did mandate that states reduce the number of minority youth that were confined within institutions because it was becoming an issue. All right, there's 3 rights that youth have when they are institutionalized. So they have the right to treatment, and that treatment that provides for rehabilitation. So they have the right to have access to treatment. But they also have access to the courts and to refuse treatment. So they can actually petition the court for relief from earlier judicial decisions. So if the courts order the juvenile to participate or to attend this residential program, they do actually have the right to go back and petition the court and say that I don't think this is appropriate. And they do that through their attorney. They also have the right to voluntarily refuse treatment unless it is one of these 3 factors. The service is legally obligated, which would be things like school. The juvenile has to attend school. You don't have a choice. The law says you do. Or the service is to prevent clear harm to physical health. So if it's a mental health issue that the juvenile has been diagnosed with, they can't refuse treatment for their mental health diagnosis. And then when the service is mandated by the court as a condition of a non-residential disposition, so if the juvenile would have been ordered to comply with, say, aggression replacement training in the community, then they also have to continue with that in the facility. But they also have the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. So it does forbid the use of corporal punishment, medications simply for control. So I mentioned earlier mental health. A facility cannot simply medicate juveniles just in order to control them so they don't have to deal with them. And they also can't spend extended periods of time in solitary confinement. There are a lot of rules and regulations in recent years that have passed on solitary confinement for juveniles. It is banned at the federal level. However, it can still be used in our state and local facilities. But with that, there are a lot of rules in place. It has to be for under a specific amount of time. The juvenile can't really be placed alone in like a locked room. They can be placed in separate areas. There's all these rules that go into whether and how we're able to use solitary confinement. So in sum, detention centers, jails, and shelters are our short-term holding facilities for juveniles. Shelters specifically were created for dependent and neglected youth. We then have boot camps, reception and diagnostic centers, ranches and forestry camps, and training centers or schools, which are our long-term facilities for youth. And training schools are going to vary in their goals and the types of programming that's offered, and they're also going to vary in the type of security level that they offer. Victimization and disproportionate minority confinement are two major issues within juvenile confinement. And then when a juvenile is placed in an institution, they have the right to access treatment, they have the right to access the courts and refuse treatment, and they also have the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. This was your Chapter 10 lecture looking at short and long-term confinement styles for juvenile offenders. I hope everyone has a fabulous week.